So I am Eric Mazur. I'm on the faculty at Harvard University, and I had the pleasure of meeting many of you this summer at the workshop we had, which was such a fun time. And it's been great to continuing to touch base with many of you. I hope this is the beginning of a network for high school teachers by high school teachers. Consider me just a fly on the wall. Although, as I mentioned at the workshop, I'm actually a certified high school teacher and I taught in a high school. It's not on my CV, but it's true. I have my PhD advisor insisted that I get a teacher certificate, and it was a fabulous experience. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I am going to give a very brief introduction to our speaker, Rob Krakehl from Stony Brook University, who is actually going to give us a two-part talk. Part one is on the history of physics education research, or is it more broadly science education research, Rob? I don't have the title in front of me.
So it is physics, but you can't really unmingle the two other sciences.
Absolutely. After all, until not that long ago, science was physics and physics was science before the other discipline branched off from it. And then in the second part of his talk, he's going to talk about something very timely, namely using Arduinos for experiments at home. And I hope that we can have an engaged discussion afterwards. The talk is pre-recorded. Some of you may have watched it online. Well, probably not, because you might not have come back here. But Rob will be able to actually answer the chat while he's talking through this technological advance. So feel free to ask questions of Rob. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob.
Hey, everybody. So my name is Rob Krakehl. I'm from Stony Brook University, and today I'll be doing a two-part presentation. The first part is a very brief history of physics education in the U.S., sort of the years between 1890 and 1920, when everything really happened in terms of why physics is the way it is. And then the second part is going to be based on the use of kind of Arduinos and cell phones and microcontrollers in the class, sticking to kind of the mechanics section of the curriculum. I would like to just thank Keith Shepard. He did help me out with a bit of the history part of this from Stony Brook University as well. And so the question I really want to know is, are we the ones who can change the course of physics education history? Are we the ones, are we the group, are we the people who can do it? And the only way I think we can answer that is if we look and understand how we got here, at least within the US, and maybe those outside the US can get a glimpse of some of the issues we're dealing with and weigh in on those. And so an even briefer overview, right? 1890s, even earlier 1860s in the US, the courses were short. They were normally 14 weeks in length, and they were very much based on textbook, classical education, as it were. The instructional methods were derived from this classical education. It was lecture, it was recitation, right? That's the college motto: no demonstrations or experimentation, very much reliant on textbooks. And there were no subject-specific teachers. There was no physics teacher. You were a teacher. And nearly anybody could teach. It was an interesting time. My favorite example is Robert Millikan, who was asked by his Greek professor to teach physics, though he had no knowledge of physics. But his Greek professor said, anyone who could do well in my Greek can teach physics. And as physicists, I think we know how that turned out for Millikan and his oil drop experiment. Now, where did a lot of the concepts and ideas that we use for our education system in physics specifically come from? And so it actually comes from way, way back and can be traced back to Gießen, Germany, the university rather. And the foundation really came from this experimental and laboratory design idea. Back with Liebig, who had directed this chemistry lab, this hands-on idea of learning. He had a student, Evan Horsford, who was an American student, and he is the one who created the Lawrence Scientific School in Liebig's image. And what happened was this was modeled after his work of a hands-on chemistry idea. Now, within his lab, and the Lawrence Scientific School, which was at Harvard. It was not necessarily part of Harvard in the way that you would think you take classes at Harvard, but it was the science school. Harvard itself was for the classics, Greek and French and that kind of learning. And Josiah P. Cook, who was hired by Harvard, was actually set up or was in the process and hired to set up a private lab to emulate the lab of Horsford. And this was open to a small number of students, where this key player by the name of Charles W. Eliot was hired. In this lab is where Eliot learned his strong appreciation for laboratory-based teaching while working with Cook. And so what happened with Eliot? How do we actually get here? So it turns out that MIT is one of the first players, and Eliot was hired alongside Francis H. Storer by MIT to establish these chemical labs. At the same time, Edward Charles Pickering, who was fresh from the Lawrence School, this laboratory method-based school, to create the first manual in physics laboratories for MIT. A lot of his work was rooted in the idea of student exploration. And actually, he said that there should be an extension to the laboratory where students can make and build and go through these ideas of learning. Now, Eliot at Harvard was hired by Harvard, became the president of Harvard. And in 1872, he had actually implemented physics as an admission option. And several years later, it became a requirement to get into Harvard. Eliot was a strong believer in science. This was vastly different to the old ways of Harvard, and he really churned a lot up. During this time, he had implemented a laboratory option for entering the school or the university, and Cook, who had worked with Eliot, actually wrote what was known as the pamphlet. And so this was a series of laboratory experiments and how to do them. The Cookbook Lab as we know it today. Based on the success of the chem, Eliot sought to create a physics laboratory option. And to do this, he had student Edwin Hall, who was working there, and he was tasked with writing the laboratory requirements for the secondary schools to follow, to sort of organize how to get into Harvard in essence. Many of these labs, or experiments rather, were based on the work of Pickering, were hands-on, and they were highly quantitative in nature, mainly based on making precise measurements. That was a lot of physics at the time, right? All about the precision. How minute can we get? At this time, Eliot instituted a policy where the completion of specific high school chemistry and physics experiments based on the pamphlet and the descriptive list would entitle the students to receive academic credit. Now, this is the first crossover between high school and college and the credit system between the two and understanding how to get from one to another. I mean, at the end of the day, information is information in this sense. What was happening in the secondary schools, though, as it turns out, it was pure chaos. Every school was teaching different. They were teaching different amounts of time. Students were in, students were out. And so the National Education Association thought we should pull together and figure out what to teach in high schools. And at this time, they had Eliot, Charles Eliot, command this, be the chair of it. As such a strong science person, out of the 9 subcommittees that were created to each subject, 3 of them were specific to science. One being the physical sciences, physics, astronomy, and chemistry. One being the national or natural history, rather, of biology, botany, zoology, and physiology. At this time, biology as we know it was not a course. It was botany or zoology in most senses. And finally, geography, which is physical geography, geology, and meteorology. And this is really kind of like the earth science curriculum. They were confronted with 11 questions, and these questions wanted to know, when should the subjects be taught? How should the subjects be taught? How long should the subjects be taught? What should they be worth? And each subcommittee came up with a majority report, and in some cases also the minority report. In the case of the subcommittee on physics, chemistry, and astronomy, they really came up with 5 main ideas that we see now. First, chemistry should precede physics, and physics should be taught in the last year of schooling. That way they have the mathematical background they need, right? And the students are a bit more mature. Physics and chemistry should be 200 hours. 50% of that time should be laboratory or experimental based. And it should be required, both of those required for college admission. You should take physics and chem if you are going to get into college. Laboratory work should be highly quantitative, and there should be a trained teacher there. That's a new idea, trained in experimental or laboratory work for physics and chem. And a laboratory notebook should be kept by the students for submission to the college upon completion of the secondary curriculum. Physics and chem should be taught the same for college and non-college bound students because it's important for everyone. That was their idea. This physics and chem is needed if you want to be a good civilian. And the study of one subject for a full year was better than 2 or more done superficially in a year. And this is really where we see that 1 year of science that is across the US. You don't do some chem and some physics and some, biology. It's kind of one each year. And this was the start of that. There was one person who dissented in the minority report. This person said that physics should precede chemistry. It should actually come first because physics relates to phenomena that's more perceptible and more tangible. Much of chemistry is based on the idea of inferences that you make off understanding this physics, use of density and thermodynamics and spectroscopy and so forth. Physics really built the foundation for chemistry back then. Chemistry was not as well known, or there was not as much chemistry as there is now, right? Leading up to the World War I, that was really the chemist's time, where the lead up to World War II was really the physicist's time, if you will. And so the overall committee came up with the following recommendations. Nearly everything was unanimous in agreement between the subcommittees. The committee also outlined 50 experiments that should be conducted, really setting the basis for what topics should be covered, such as general matter, fluid mechanics, what we now know as classical mechanics, kinematics, rotation. They also said heat, light, sound, and the introduction to electricity. Now, the one thing that is really, really interesting is they actually put physics in the sophomore year of the high school sequence. Physics was so important to these people of this subcommittee that they thought physics needs to be taken before students leave. At this time, students had the tendency to leave very early on in the high school curriculum so that they can go work. Now, the committee of 10, the recommendations never really went anywhere. They were just recommendations. So the college, or the Committee on College Entrance Requirements, was created, the CCER, in the effort to implement the recommendations of the COT. Now, Hall actually chaired the physics subcommittee, several subcommittees, just like last committee. That's the kind of theme, is subcommittees and committees. And this committee consisted of people from secondary and higher education. It was about an even mix. And the goals of the CCER were very similar to the COT. What defines a course? How long should a course be? What should the sequence be? What textbooks are used? What references are used? What notebooks? What should be the lab? So on and so forth. And the outcomes were kind of interesting. This is where the first national unit, or the credit system that's very apparent in the US, came to be. In 1906, this eventually became the Carnegie unit, which is learned seat time. That's why labs are twice the time as a regular class session, but worth half as much, essentially. They also recommended that each science be worth 1 year, 1 credit, which is considered a year of study. Physics should have been a qualitative class while you are participating in class, and quantitative in the laboratory, with 50% of the time dedicated to that. At this time, biology was not yet a science, and instead still consisted of botany and zoology. And overall, this implemented the elective system, which is a vast change, this idea of relevant courses for students. The byproduct of this, and one of the catastrophes that occurred during this committee, is they only required 1 unit in science to be taken, recommending that it be physics, but not requiring that it be physics. This would come back later to be a very detrimental result. The idea that people are going to use the electives to take sciences. There were roughly 6 units that students could take in addition to their regular required courses. They also recommended that teachers in the secondary schools be college graduates, which up to this point, it could be anybody. So the Committee on College Entrance Requirements actually said, once again, physics should be taught before chemistry. Physical geography can be taught early on, and so can the idea of biology, which was either botany and zoology, or botany or zoology, depending on what the schools offered, depending on the size of the school. Now, there was some other stuff that happened really poorly in here. One of the biggest things was Hall's, what I may consider his biggest blunder, and maybe his more crowning achievement, though more of a dunce crown than a king's crown. He was the head of the physics subcommittee, and the physics subcommittee that he picked was several people who had written textbooks and lab manuals, and as a result, they could not come to an agreement. As a product, Hall wanted to give Nightingale, who was the head of the whole committee, an answer. And so what he did is he simply submitted his descriptive list and told everyone on the subcommittee, if you think otherwise, you should submit something as well. One other person actually did submit something, and he only added 14 other experiments. And so there was no physics outline that was expected. There was no syllabi that was submitted. There was no list of topics. In fact, there was no anything. And so the byproduct of this became massive. Shortly after this committee, the College Entrance Examination Board, College Board as we know it now, was created to standardize the admission process. First exam for physics was 1901, so about a year to 2 years after the recommendations of the college entrance, the Committee on College Entrance Requirements gave. Again, this was another brainchild of Eliot, and you can really see the influence that Harvard had, and it seems that we may be back here, as well as Butler from Columbia. So this committee, or really I guess it's more of a board, a group of people, consisted of 12 colleges who created standardized exam for college admissions, now known as the SAT-2s. They based these exams on the recommendations of the Committee of College Entrance Requirements, which for physics meant it was 2 paragraphs of really no substance and then 61 quantitative labs. And therefore the first test was based on this. Now, in 1908, the National Commission of Teaching of Elementary Physics came together, known as the New Movement, and they wrote a new set of physics requirements in about 1909. But between 1901 and 1909, physics really got that reputation of it's difficult and not for the standard person. Several years later, about 20-ish years later, at the end of World War I, about 1918, there was a massive decrease in students taking sciences and low exams, scores on the college entrance exams. The Commission of the Reorganization of Secondary Education, the CRSE, published the cardinal principles, once again calling for prepping students for life, everyday life, which we hear about again. It's a thing now. We have to prepare these students for life. They had, again, a subcommittee, the Commission of Science, and this was the Committee on the Reorganization of Science in the Secondary Schools, with the proper acronym of CRISIS, which is about what occurred after them. So why did they want to fix physics? Well, physics was too frequently assumed that a principle may be readily grasped if only once stated clear language and illustrated by a few examples, which many of us know now. Show once, practice once, you should know it. The content has been too largely handed down through tradition, through textbooks, and they were based on the logical order of the subject matter, but not the interest of the pupils. We still, in many cases, follow this same science sequence where 1D kinematics, vectors, 2D kinematics, then you go into energy and momentum. But why? Why do we not start with waves? Why do we not start with circuits? Why do we not start with nearly anything? The use of formal recitation, right? Recitation, you would stand, you would just recite what you've learned, and therefore you've learned it. We know that doesn't really work. And the fact that the high school lab was too often the place to verify laws and fix problems and not just to learn. Well, this commission made the recommendation that a few things should occur. First, they created biology as a course. It was recommended that biology be taught in the 9th or 10th year, depending on the school size. Of course, they did not mention, like many of the other committees, other than maybe the COT, that chemistry or physics should be taught before the other. But unfortunately, combined with the Committee on the College Entrance Requirements recommendation that science be worth or require only 1 credit, physics and chemistry became electives. And you can see this incredible drop-off at around 1920 of physics. And we're still suffering from this today with only about 30 to 39% of students taking a course in physics. And so what should we do? Is it time to revisit some of these ideas that have continuously been stated? Is it time that we create new standards and maybe do away with this sequencing, or do away with the idea of kinematics first, before forces, before circuits, before modern physics? Why hasn't the curriculum changed at all? I mean, since the early 1900s, 1906, and so on with special relativity, we're still teaching the same stuff that was capped. Now with AP Physics 1 and AP Physics 2 going to 2 years, it's a bit more flexibility, but still we're here. And do colleges have just too much influences on the high school in general? Or is it time that we rethink the hierarchy of education and remove the idea of, you know, a secondary school, then college, and have this flow through instead in the United States? And so I want to shift now with all of that in mind, and, you know, us not changing since the 1920s, 100 years later, maybe there are some things that we can do. You know, the use of Arduinos and cell phones in the classroom, the use of technology. And, you know, I want to just present a few ideas. And full disclosure, I'm not supported by any of these devices or apps. Anything I've used, I've got, or I've found, or I've made. And so the goals for this section, I would just want to provide you with insight as to some of the hardware that's out there, the relative cost of that hardware, common experiments that we can do with these, implementing some of these microcontrollers and some of the problems, some of the solutions I think that we can work towards. And then for this, since it's such a large and vast topic, I want to stick to just mechanics, all right? Just the kind of first half of the year, or maybe even the first whole year, depending what course you teach. So to get some of this technology in the classroom, Vernier is one of the first companies that many people think of, and this would be their introductory set of devices that you need at a whopping $1,082. And if you wanted to outfit a classroom with one for every student, you're looking at 30 grand. And if you wanted kids to do this at home, it would just never happen. It's just way too much money. And so one thing that we can implement instead of using this is this idea of using a microcontroller. All a microcontroller is, right, is a brain. It can be programmed like a computer. It can receive and send information from sensors to the computer and vice versa. They have capabilities of communicating through USB, through Bluetooth, through Wi-Fi. And so this might be the platform. These run very cheap. You can get some for $3. You can get some for $50. This one, which is the very standard one, you can get for about $15 to $30. And so what you use with these are different chips. And so this would be the Arduino motion sensor, and there's a bunch of motion sensors. All this really is a sonic range finder, and it's a whopping $4 as opposed to like a $100 motion sensor. So all you really need to do to start implementing the sensor is basic kinematics. How does the sensor work? Well, it sends a chirp and it receives the chirp if it reflects off something. It uses sonar, which you can have a conversation with your students, how it relates to animals. How do bats use it? How do dolphins use it? This also brings up the conversation of what is the speed of sound? How can we utilize the speed of sound? Now, I know speed of sound is temperature dependent. You could hook up a thermoresistor or a thermometer or some kind of gauge to the Arduino as well to account for the variation in temperature. But for now, we're going to go with the classical ideal physics of it's the same temperature of STP everywhere, even if it's not. And ultimately, all you need to know is how to solve for the distance once you have this. And so let's just jump right into kind of the code and the thought and how we do it in the circuit. So this would be the basic circuit for a motion sensor. Right? You want to measure how somebody moves. You want to measure the change in position with respect to time. This is the circuit we're going to use. Now, I know you're probably saying, I haven't coded. It's fine. It's very straightforward, and I want to show you that. So first, the Arduinos have pins, and all the pins are the way to send or receive information. Some of them are analog. They read a voltage just like a voltmeter, and some of them are digital. They just read a high or a low. Right? They can send 5 volts out. They can receive 5 volts in. You can read in between. So what we do here is we define 2 pins, a trigger pin and an echo pin. The trigger pin, it turns on the chirp, and the echo pin listens to the chirp. It makes perfect sense. If you were to stand somewhere and clap, you would hear it echo back, and there you go. You're essentially using sonar. Right? What we did is we set up the trigger pin to be an output to send a sound, and the echo pin to be an input to receive a sound. Right? It's just like decoding a language. Now you can have great conversations with your kids. Like, how do we actually make the code? What's the thought process for the code? You don't need to actually write the code, but you should understand how to utilize this. So what do we have to do? Well, if we want to figure out how far something is, we need to send a chirp, send a sound. We need to listen to the chirp, have the chirp come back. And then if we know the time in between there, we can probably find some relationship to calculate the distance, right? If you know the speed of sound, it would take 343 meters per second to get, that's its speed there, that's its speed back. If you know the time, if we chop the time in half, we should be able to work out with V is D over T, or the change in distance or displacement over time, depending how you're talking to your students and what you're going about. And so, this, again, the actual circuit, here's the code. What do? Well, we turn the trigger pin on, it sends a chirp. We turn the trigger pin off so it's not continuously sending. We listen, and we listen for the time in between. Well, we take that time and divide it by 2. We times it by the centimeters per second, and we print it out. That's all the code. The amount of things that you can do with this, once you have this code in the Arduino, which is simply use the Arduino app, the IDE, you copy this code in and you hit upload and you are going. And I know, dude, I can't do that. I can't do the code either. I could. It's a lot of work. We know it's a lot of work. There are plenty of platforms and projects already out there that have a lot of the code written. All you need to do is take the code, upload it, and you're good to go. So the kit that I use, and I want to show you, I did a little bit stuff today just to check how simplistic it is to actually hop in and do some of this. And so this kit retails, I think it was about $30 to $50, depending where you bought it. And the main things that it comes with that we really care about, it has the Arduino. Now I know this doesn't look like the same Arduino. Some would call it a knockoff, but the key here is the fact that it has this same microcontroller in it, the Atmega 32, if you'd like to look it up. And it has the sonic sensor. The other nice thing it has is it has this over here, which is a breadboard, and it's a protective layer you can put over your Arduino so that you can build right on top of your Arduino, or whichever chipset you use. Arduino is kind of the standard. It's like saying bubblegum or Pepto. And so I built this. It took me approximately 5 minutes to open up the packaging, put the chipsets together, plug it into the computer, upload the code, and I was taking data. And you can see I have a graph here. What I did, I just took the serial output, which is part of the Arduino app that sped out numbers. I took those numbers, copied them to Excel, and plotted this. And you can see that it's relatively smooth, 0 to 80 centimeters away. And all in all, this only cost me about $15 to make, right? If this were to break, it only costs $15 to $20 to replace in total. And the nice thing is, if one of the chip pieces fail, maybe you break a wire or you break a pin, you could change the code to account for that. So they really are protected. The other thing you could do is you could 3D print a case or something like that. So one of the things I really like to do with this, and I think could easily be done, is walk the graph. And so I have the students set this up on their desk, and then I give them a worksheet like this that has a position time graph. And I say, hey, walk that, make that motion, record the data until you get that same graph. And so here's data that I took today. I would have the kids do this as well. You can see I'm not too far off, a little over, a little under. I guess it all averages out. And what does this let you do? It lets you go through the model equations. It lets you talk about the 1/2 AT squared plus VIT plus your initial position. It lets you talk about modeling fits. This also gives you the idea to be able to try different models, quadratic versus exponential versus linear, and being able to linearize this information depending on the course that you're teaching. There's a lot of other things you can do with this. You can do position, velocity, or acceleration time graphs. You can do the graph matching, like I said. You could do free fall, drop a ball down onto it, make a little gate, protective gate. You could do air resistance with the coffee filter. That's a fantastic lab. Coffee filters fall at terminal velocity, or rather reach terminal velocity rather quickly, and you get these beautiful graphs that you can then figure out by changing the mass of the coffee filter, what some of the coefficients for air resistance are. You can do simple harmonic motion with a bobbing pendulum, or rather a bobbing mass on a string. We'll get to a pendulum in a minute. With some other parts, you can also do acceleration on an inclined plane, conservation of momentum, Atwood's machines. These are things that you probably already have in the classroom, but you don't necessarily have the devices to measure them quicker, right? An Atwood's machine trying to do the calculations to be able to get the accelerations and so forth using just a meter stick and a stopwatch can be rather time consuming. And so here's, basic setups. These are straight from Vernier's site, but instead of using their stuff, you can go ahead and make your own sensors, or actually you can use Vernier sensors with the Arduino. They have a hub attachment that you can use if you have older sensors. So you can do the walk back and forth and the graphing. In the case of using an inclined plane, it can be a piece of wood with a wooden card on it. And all you need to do is stack it up on some books and let it go. With the free fall and air resistance, like I said, the coffee filter is fantastic. You can place the coffee filter under the motion sensor that you made. You can drop the balls onto the motion sensor if you put some kind of protective gate. So you can really do almost an entire thing in mechanics with just this motion sensor. Now, the other thing you can also make very, very cheap is the photo gate. All it is an IR detector and IR LED, and you get about 10 pairs of those for $6. Right? So you can outfit a classroom with photo gates. Each student can have 2 photo gates to do a time distance between. You could use a picket fence, which you can make, just a piece of cardboard that you can cut slots into, and that would let you do free fall. You can mount that on a wooden car or some kind of moving vehicle, and you can find the acceleration maybe of a pullback car, or you can find, constant velocity of a buggy car or something like that. And for rotational motion, you can make a disc that has slots in it that can spin. As long as you know the distance between those slots, then you can do anything. You can measure any kind of rotational. You can also do projectile motion, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, and pendulums, right? The pendulum can swing through, triggering this and give you time intervals from end to end. This is a perfect example of how the projectile motion can happen. You can do this in the classroom. The ramp can be a PVC pipe. The ramp could be a marble slide. The ramp could just be a ruler with an indent in the middle that a marble goes down, and it would trigger these photo gates. Now I know maybe these photo gates are a little sketchier looking because we don't have this kind of holder like this, but these could be made. I mean, you could use cardboard. These are very light IR sensors. They weigh nearly nothing. In the case of the picket fence, like I said, you drop the picket fence through, you can build it with Legos, you can build it with nearly anything. All you need to know is the distance between the markings that trigger the sensor being connected or the sensor being not connected. The other thing you can do is, right, these are just 2 chipsets. In one case, it's actually only a chipset, and it's basically like an LED and a sensor, IR sensor and an IR transmitter. You could get like a 3-axis gyro, a 3-axis accelerometer, and a 3-axis magnetometer for a whopping $8. So for about $30, right, you are fully in to be able to do all of rotation. You're able to do all of acceleration and forces, essentially, other than pulling and pushing forces. And you can do magnetics. So you can do the magnetic field of a permanent magnet and watch that 1 over r squared or 1 over r cubed. You can put this sensor, again, this is the Vernier setup, but you can put this with the Arduino on here and watch it rotate around, and you could drop clay on it and watch as that angular momentum changes. Now, maybe you don't have the time this year to be able to get all this stuff, but again, these are chips and sensors, and actually your phone has quite a few of these. It actually does have the 3-axis accelerometer and the magnetometer and the gyroscope. It also has pressure sensors, which is really fun if you're on an elevator, or actually if you take a train or a subway that goes underground, right? I have a train that goes from where I am in Huntington over to New York, and you go under the river, and you can always feel the pressure change, and it's cool to take your phone on it and see the pressure change. So when I teach fluids to my students, I tell them, hey, pre-COVID, when you go to the city, record the pressure and watch that change. So in this case, 5Fox is what I used. It's an app that just gives you access to all your sensors. And the other night I was actually hanging out with my girlfriend, and I said, hey, I want to try something. I've got this gyroscope data. Can you spin me around in a chair? And I want to watch it, kind of decay out. And she's like, you're out of your mind, but, opportunity to spin your boyfriend around until he gets sick. Let's do it. And so she did that, and you can see the data that I got. and this awesome decay. And so from this, this angular change, you can get the angular acceleration, and you can talk about the frictional torque and just torque in general. And, nearly everybody has phones now, and trying to get a hold of even older phones, may be able to outfit your classroom if the Arduinos don't work, or you're looking for a more readily accessible item. Now, I do think there are a couple issues that need to be resolved. So first, students may not know how to program. Many people don't, although the access to that's getting larger. Students may not know how to set up the circuits. Students, there may be a cost prohibiting to this. The idea is that by using some of these cheaper sets, you may be able to outfit the classroom at a much, much lower cost and give access. These things can break, though you can modify the code to be able to change what pins are being used, and minute details that aren't the bigger picture that you really need to see. And you do need an access to a computer to program these things. And the kids can do it if you give them the code. It really is drag, drop, click, play. Now, I do think I have some possible solutions from using these in my class. One, if we start to create an organized database that has these codes and schematics and experimental designs and what is possible, but not how to do it, but what is also possible, you may be able to just implement these much faster into the classroom. Second, I think creating a phone or computer app specifically for physics that teaches you how to set up the circuit and to upload the code, and also reads the output from it to you would be fantastic. And finally, I think that integrating these Arduinos and these sets with like an online textbook may be the future of physics education, to stop doing it so linearly and allow for more playing. And so over the summer, we saw, Concord Consortium had this idea. And one of the things I really liked is this idea of, hey, here's the setup with cardboard, a motion sensor, which can be made with the Arduino, a cheap toy car, and tape. And what do? You hook your sensor up to this online platform, and it reads it out into a graph for you. And then what do you do after that? Well, you talk about the prediction. What did you see? How did it compare? What happened? It's no longer this idea of just a textbook and then a lab and then this. It's now this idea that maybe we can make everything cohesive. And in the way that we are now, where a lot of people are educating at home, maybe this is the platform that we can use to be able to make that education more meaningful in the laboratory sense, but also in the sense that maybe the laboratory is no longer going to be separate. This integration of the prediction, the data takings, reflection, and comparisons may be the way that we need to move to make the education local. And so with that in mind, I have the references. All of this stuff will be posted along with any references that I've, gained. And then this is me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was absolutely spectacular. I was Googling, taking notes. I was doing everything at the same time while you were talking. So, thank you for the inspiration. First of all, for the wonderful historical retrospective. It was really interesting to put some of the things you said into perspective, and also to see how little has changed in education, and in particular in physics education. And then your the part about the Arduinos really made me sit on the edge of my chair, because I'm thinking it'd be just great for me also, and I think for many of us, to find ways of joining hands together and coming up with a solid list of experiments and projects, smaller experiments, larger projects to do. And I was thinking, what would be, and Rob, maybe you have thought about this more than I have, what would be a great way of curating things, sharing, exchanging ideas? I mean, we could start a whole workshop simply on physics experiments at home, with or without Arduino. I mean, much more generally, how do you, I mean, as you know from my course, I'm constantly struggling is, what do we send to students? What do we ask them to do? How do we make it meaningful for them? So what would be a great way to coordinate a more systematic effort at doing it. But why don't we put that question on hold for just a moment? I've seen that many more people have signed up, which to me is an indication that people have watched the video before coming here. Good. Because I mean, the more we get into a habit of doing that, the more we can free up this time, which is a precious free day for us, Saturday, right, to talk and interact. So I hope that we slowly can migrate to a habit of watching the talk asynchronously and then getting together to talk to the speaker and to dig deeper. But Rob, I'm going to use my privilege as chairperson of this talk here to ask the first question. As I was listening to you, and as we went into the breakout room, and I was lucky enough to be in your breakout room, I was thinking, physics really, I mean, and also the first part of your talk sort of highlighted that, right? I mean, you look at what Charles Elliott and others did in that committee of 10, and they fell into a trap which I think we all often tend to fall into, namely to think about content first, the content trap. I mean, here's a list of subjects that people need to quote unquote know, not internalize, just know and be able to regurgitate. But basically, physics is a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking much more than a set of, equations or statements or laws or whatever you want to call it. It's a way of looking at the universe and extracting models and constructing an understanding for how things work. So it really is a way of thinking. And I think teaching physics as a way of thinking is much more important than saying, oh, have I checked off all of these subjects, which clearly started over 100 years ago. So I'm wondering, would it not be possible to, and in a sense, in my course, I've taken the first step to that, but maybe I should be way more bolder and, forget about a textbook, forget about content, design a set of experiments for people to work on and discover, maybe not all of physics, but at least a part, and internalize that and learn as a way of understanding. I would, if anybody here is interested in that, I would love to start an effort to roll up the sleeves and think about designing such a course. I certainly have the freedom to do that because I'm not constrained by standards. Yes, I have colleagues to deal with who are still stuck in, the Middle Ages, but I can handle them. But I don't have, the school imposing any restrictions on me. So I'd love to hear. So your thoughts, Rob?
So personally, it's funny. I recall a time I was taking my E&M, upper division E&M course, and you know how that is. It's all just calculus for basically the entire course. And I remember the one professor was like, look, there's an experiment we can do that combines numerical methods, analytical methods, and experimental methods. And it's easy. All you're using is a voltmeter taking data, and then you could put them together and do this paper. And we said, let's do it. Well, what's stopping us? The only thing that was stopping us was the departmental people who were, that's not how physics is taught. And personally, the more that I teach and the longer I'm into this career, the more that I'm seeing, every textbook is like that. It's, well, we got to do kinematics first, or we got to do all of 1D motion first, and then you can learn 2D motion. And it's one of those things that I'm like, by the age that we have these kids, they've all thrown a ball up in the air. They're all using these cell phones. They're all taking these mathematic courses, but then they come in and you can't do a graph, or you can't do a basic algebra question, or you can't do, in some cases, basic fractions. And I remember one of my professors was like, yeah, he went to school in Europe. He said, we didn't take, quote unquote, physics. We took applied math, which would be like the American physics. When we took physics, it was a very conceptual course that was part chemistry and part biology. And I really think, once that push happens, and there will absolutely be pushback, it's been 100 years since biology became a thing, and we're still here doing what we're doing. But I think that once that push starts coming, and I do think it has to come from the college and university level, because that's where, right, the high school kids want to go there. So if that's what they're doing, then the high schools are going to have to match. Whereas when you try to push it the other way, it just doesn't dovetail.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand in the participant list. So click on the participant button right there, somewhere here, I think, and click the raise hand button. You know, it's interesting what you said at the end there. It has to start at the college level. I mean, I think a lot of introductory science teachers, I'm using a broader term here because it's not just physics. I know it's true for my chemistry and other science discipline colleagues as well, is that, you know, it really should start in school, because we just react to whatever happens at the input end. And then in between this is the ETS with its, you know, AP, SAT, and so on. So we really have a system that is very hard to disrupt. Anyway, so if you want to ask a question, either unmute yourself and ask your question, or raise your hand. I'm definitely thinking about how we can take this further. I think it would be really hard to spend a significant amount of time during the academic year. I don't know about you. I feel I'm pretty much out of cycles, but maybe we should actually go to the NSF or the Department of Education, apply for funding for a workshop on at-home science experiments or at-home physics experiments, to actually, and it would be really not so much a show and tell workshop, but very much let's work together to develop a curriculum around, you know, discovering science by doing science at home. Let's see.
Actually, I see, not to cut you off, Eric, I see Linda asked a question with a +1, and then Miss Monty is in the similar thing with the NGSS.
Yeah.
And actually, so personally, I do think the NGSS might fall into the same categories as past kind of attempts to change stuff. So at least in New York, right, they're pushing basically the NGSS, which is the mixing of all the sciences, except the end of the year tests are still supposed to be just a physics test and a chemistry test and then a biology test. And I think as long as that remains, it'll never change. And in a case like Miss Monty, like you said, rearranging the sciences, I think a lot of it really comes down to the graduation requirements, right? If you're only required to take 2 sciences, you'll only take 2. And actually, there was a study in Chicago that schools that took required 4 years of sciences actually had a decrease in science achievement. And so there's really this aspect of what is called the social capital and cultural capital. And, you know, the social capital is getting everybody actually involved in wanting to do these things. And then the cultural capital is, you know, as a community, are they into this? And can they afford it? And so I think there's a couple of these barriers that really have to be hammered home at that, you said, that much higher level before kind of the steps are built. Like I know you said, normally the steps are built and then the upstairs follows. So the elementary teachers work for the secondary teachers, and the secondary teachers for the tertiary or post-secondary. But from looking at the historical aspect, it's really worked the other way around.
Elmary has her hand up. Please unmute yourself if you're muted. Where's Elmary? On my screen.
I don't know if you,
oh, there you are. You're in the top left corner. Yes.
So Rob, I've got and maybe it's a question to the whole group. What is interesting to me, and I'm not trying to throw my biology and chemistry colleagues under the bus, but so in the beginning, when we started with this online or remote teaching, they were the ones that immediately said, we cannot do at-home experiments. It is too dangerous. And it cost a lot of effort from us as physics teachers to say, well, can you do this? Can you do this? So maybe the need for at-home experiments is bigger than just the physics community. Maybe it is a science community issue. And I can almost see the physics driving this because there's a lot of physics know-how that can be then eventually used to do chemistry and biology experiments at home.
I personally would agree. And I know that's something that we're having fights within our high school is, well, we can't do this and we can't do that and we can't do this. And then I'm like, well, some of our SUNY colleges have just take-home kits. You know, I get it. Maybe it's a 16-year-old versus a 19-year-old. And there is that aspect of it. You know, do I want a 16-year-old playing with some of these things? I don't trust some of my 18-year-olds playing with some of these things. But the other part of that is I question if that is a school cultural thing where the teachers kind of push that stuff off. And so it never gets that idea of like, hey, if you do this, you're going to have a really bad outcome, right? It's kind of like the fall down and scrape your knee and then you learn to not fall down anymore. And I've always wondered if that kind of aspect is part of the issue that exists, other than some of the legality stuff.
Great. Rob, thank you so much. It's actually exactly noon, and I want to stick to the promise of staying on time. So I'm going to create 2 breakout rooms. Room 1, chat with Rob. Room 2, socialize. And we're going to use this new feature of Zoom where you can assign yourself. There are many new features of Zoom, by the way, but you must have downloaded the last one. You can quickly check. If you click on reactions, you should be able to express many more emotions than you were before. I think I can express this emotion because I really loved your talk. I found it extremely inspiring and it's created you know, a lot of opportunity to reflect on some of the things I do. So Rob, I can't thank you enough. A virtual and a real applause for you. Thank you so much for taking your precious time, not only to record the talk, but then also to be here on Saturday. And thank you all for coming. If you cannot assign yourself to a breakout room, we can push you into it. Everybody else can come and go whichever way you want. I'm gonna close the official part of the PoLS talk now and leave it running. You can go whenever you want. You can jump into one of the 2 rooms. If you cannot jump yourself, the way you do is you click on the breakout room button and then you'll see there are 2 breakout rooms. You can go. Rob, you have no choice. I'm sorry. You have to go and talk with yourself. Great. Well, so thank you so much. And the next talk will be on November 21st. And they just arm twisted me to give a talk. I'm not 100% sure what I'll be talking about yet. I think I'll be talking either about ownership of learning or about assessment, one of those 2, but I haven't made up my mind yet. Although now I'm also thinking maybe I can show some of the things we're doing in terms of facilitated remote work, such as Desmos, for example, with students. So it's still a jumble in my head. But by the time I give the talk, I'll know what I'm going to be speaking about. So thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope some of you will stay. And I definitely hope to see you on November 21st.